The moment she was ordered to remove her uniform did not feel like a single point in time. It unfolded slowly, like the air itself tightened around her. She had walked into the clubhouse expecting a simple meeting, something routine, something she could get through without drawing attention. She kept her posture straight, the familiar fabric settling on her shoulders like a reminder of who she had been and who she still was beneath everything she tried to blend into. But the eyes started the moment she entered, a dozen stares tracing the patches on her sleeve, the cut of the jacket, the weight of a past most people only understood from movies. At first, no one said a word. They only watched. Some leaned to the side to whisper behind hands. Others narrowed their gaze as if her presence was an inconvenience. She took a seat near the back, hoping that would quiet the restless energy circling her like a slow tide. It did not. The murmurs kept rising until the board president cleared her throat with a sound that snapped across the room. The president flipped through a binder filled with regulations, flipping with purpose, hunting for a rule she already knew by heart. The uniform policy, the so-called dress code, meant to keep things tidy and neutral. No symbols, no service attire, no exceptions. She knew what was coming before the woman even looked up, but knowing did not dull the sting. The president called her by her last name with a tone that carried judgment wrapped in politeness. Then she asked her to stand. She rose slowly, shoulders squared. The president said the uniform did not meet HOA guidelines. She said that attire with rank, insignia, or emblems counted as prohibited display. She said rules kept order and fairness. But the way she spoke betrayed something else, a mix of suspicion and discomfort, as if the uniform itself threatened the quiet predictability of the neighborhood. A few people nodded. One man muttered that rules were rules. Another said it was nothing personal. She kept her breathing steady because she had trained herself through situations far more intense than a crowded room of uneasy neighbors. Yet something about the moment made her feel exposed in a way she had never felt in hostile territory. Back then she had purpose. Here she had to stand still while they treated her like a disruption. The president asked her to remove the jacket so the meeting could continue. Just the jacket, she said. A small thing, she said. A compliance issue, nothing more. But there was something sharp beneath those words, as if the request was not about the uniform at all, but about asserting control. The request carried a kind of impatience that signaled this was not a negotiation. It was an order disguised as procedure. She looked around the room. Some people avoided her eyes. Others stared with a kind of judgment that hit harder than direct hostility. She wondered how many had any idea what the patches on that jacket meant. She wondered how many could imagine the nights she had spent wearing a uniform far heavier than this one, soaked in sweat, adrenaline, and the weight of decisions no rulebook could guide. Still, she did not argue. She unbuttoned the collar with slow, measured movements. Every gesture reminded her of being in the field where each action needed precision. But this was not a battlefield. This was a room with folding chairs, a coffee urn, and a crowd that watched her like she was an inconvenience they wanted handled. As she moved, whispers rose again. Someone said she was being dramatic. Someone else said if she followed the rules like everyone else, none of this would be happening. Her fingers paused on the last button. A quiet tremor ran through her that she refused to show on her face. She was not afraid of the room. She was not afraid of judgment. What she feared was what removing the jacket would reveal. She had spent years covering the marks left on her skin by moments she would never be free from. She had learned to carry them in silence, because secrecy was part of the oath she had taken. These scars were not badges, and they were not stories she could share. They were consequences, memories carved into her when missions went sideways or required sacrifices she never spoke about. She felt every breath in the room holding still. She did not know if they sensed her hesitation or if they were simply waiting for a disruption to pass. Her hand stayed at her shoulder for a moment longer than intended. The fabric felt heavier than before, as if it carried the weight of everything she had endured. She understood that removing it in this quiet suburban room would reveal more truth than anyone here was prepared to face. The tension and judgment in the room began long before anyone spoke. It lived in the way people shifted in their seats, the way a few tilted their heads as if trying to decide what to make of her. The clubhouse was usually filled with small talk and neighborly noise, the kind of harmless chatter that made meetings feel predictable. But today the air felt tight, stretched thin by curiosity and discomfort. She felt every glance like a pinprick along her back, each one searching for a reason to label her as something other than one of them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, far too bright, exposing every twitch of expression on the faces around her. A couple near the front leaned toward each other, whispering behind raised hands. Their eyes flicked back to her between sentences. A man across the aisle had his arms crossed so tight his shoulders were nearly touching his ears, his gaze locked on her uniform, as if it were a violation he could feel from a distance. No one tried to hide their scrutiny. They watched her openly, as if her presence required explanation, as if the uniform she wore shifted the balance of their safe little world. She kept her posture controlled, her breathing even. She had been trained to read rooms far more dangerous than this one, where a single wrong move carried consequences. Here the danger came in the form of quiet judgment, but it still pressed on her with a surprising force. The neighbors she waved to during morning walks now looked at her like she was a stranger who had broken some unspoken rule simply by entering the room. The board members shuffled papers at the front table, pretending to stay focused on the agenda printed neatly on their clipboards. But their eyes drifted back to her again and again. One woman tapped her pen with a steady, irritated rhythm. Another flipped through documents she had already reviewed, flipping just to keep her hands busy. They all felt it, the way the atmosphere seemed to gather around her like static. No one wanted to be the first to say something, yet everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to make the moment official. Even the quiet felt different. It was not the calm kind of silence that settles between neighbors who know each other's routines. This silence was thick, expectant. It carried questions she had no intention of answering and assumptions that rose like smoke from a fire no one admitted was burning. A few people tried to return their attention to the agenda, but their focus broke every few seconds, their eyes sliding back to her shoulders, her sleeves, the insignia they did not recognize. She could feel their unease more than she heard it. People sat straighter, as if better posture created moral distance. Someone cleared their throat, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to push the tension somewhere else. She felt the room calculating her in the way civilians often did, trying to fit her into a box that made sense to them. Soldier, enforcer, rule breaker, threat. They cycled through labels without understanding any of them. Her fingers sat still on her lap, but her mind stayed alert. She was used to being assessed. What she was not used to was the lack of context. These people knew nothing about her. They did not know the work she had done, the places she had been, or the nights she had spent fighting to make sure others could sleep safely in their beds. None of that mattered here. All they saw was a uniform they believed did not belong. The irony of that hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years defending people who would never know her name, and now she could not sit in a community meeting without becoming the center of suspicion. A young couple near the window whispered loudly enough that their words carried across the room. She heard them mention the rules, then compliance, then the need to maintain order. Words that sounded harmless but dripped with judgment. Other neighbors nodded along quietly, trying to appear neutral while still aligning themselves with whatever the majority decided. It was the kind of behavior she had seen in groups many times before. No one wanted to stand alone, so they chose the safest path, the easiest rule, the simplest explanation for their discomfort. The tension built in the pauses between glances, in the edges of unfinished whispers, in the way people shifted their weight as if bracing for a confrontation. She felt the pressure rising, not like a sudden wave, but like a slow, steady climb that made the room feel smaller with each passing second. And through it all, not one person asked her why she wore the uniform. Not one asked if she had a reason. They focused only on the rule, on how she looked, on what her presence meant to them instead of what it meant to her. The scars that stopped everyone cold were not meant to be seen. They were the kind of marks that lived under layers of fabric, under years of silence, under rules she had followed without question. When the jacket slipped from her shoulder, Even slightly, the room changed in a way no one could deny. People who had been whispering fell quiet. People who had been judging froze mid-breath. It was as if the air itself stalled, trapped between disbelief and the uncomfortable realization that they were looking at something they had never expected to confront in their tidy community clubhouse. The skin along her shoulder and upper arm was a map of stories she never planned to share. Faded lines, raised ridges, small disruptions in smooth skin that carried memories she had learned to lock away. To her, they were familiar. She had lived with them long enough that the shock of seeing them in the mirror had disappeared years ago. But to this group of neighbors, the marks looked foreign, unsettling, and heavy with meaning. They did not know what each line had cost her. They only knew, instinctively, that these were not the kind of scars people collect from accidents or clumsiness. These were scars that hinted at violence, danger, and choices most people never have to make. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her chest, as if steadying herself. Her eyes widened, not in disgust, but in something closer to fear mixed with respect. A man who had been the loudest about rules a moment earlier now stared with his mouth slightly open, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. This was not what he had expected when he told her to follow regulations. This was not a simple dress code issue anymore. The truth shifted the ground beneath their feet, and they did not know how to react. The board president, who had spoken with such confidence before, lost her rhythm. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to piece together the next part of her statement. She looked at the scars, then at the room, then back at the scars again, as if each glance rewrote the narrative she had been building. She had come prepared to enforce a rule. She had not come prepared for this. No one had. She felt all of their eyes on her, but this time the attention held a different weight. It was no longer suspicion or judgment. It was something quieter, something that carried an undercurrent of realization. They were seeing evidence of a world that existed far beyond their property lines and garden maintenance schedules. They were seeing pieces of moments she had kept buried because explaining them would break the silence she had sworn to maintain. The room stayed quiet in a way that felt too loud. She did not move. She let the jacket rest halfway down her arm, because she knew pulling it back up would only create more questions. She also knew that covering the scars would not make them unseeable. They had already landed in the room with a force stronger than any speech or explanation. People leaned forward slightly, drawn in by something they did not understand. They tried to decipher meaning from the patterns carved into her skin, but none of them could come close to the truth. They did not know the night she earned the jagged cut that now looked like a pale lightning strike across her shoulder. They did not know the mission that left the smaller, deeper line along her tricep, or the moment she saved a teammate and walked away with a scar as a reminder of what loyalty sometimes demands. A few neighbors looked away, not because they were offended, but because the intensity of the moment unsettled them. They were not used to confronting raw evidence of pain, sacrifice, or survival up close. In their world, danger lived inside news stories or dramas on television. It did not sit 3 feet away from them in a community meeting. And yet here it was, undeniable and human and more real than anything they had prepared themselves for. She kept her face steady, letting none of her thoughts show. Part of her wanted to pull the jacket back up out of instinct, but another part of her understood that the damage was already done. The truth had slipped out, uninvited but unavoidable. And the room, with all its rules and tidy expectations, now had to confront the fact that the person they had been ready to scold carried the weight of experiences they could not imagine. The silence stretched, not hostile now, but heavy with shifting perspective. The crowd that had been so sure of itself only minutes earlier now looked different. Their eyes held questions they would not dare ask out loud. Questions about what she had lived through, what she had survived, and what it meant that someone with scars like hers had been sitting quietly among them all this time. The weight of classified missions she could never explain settled over her the moment the first pair of eyes dropped from her scars back to her face. People wanted answers. It was obvious in the way they stared, in how their expressions tightened with curiosity they did not know how to hide. They were neighbors who liked clarity and clean explanations, but nothing about her past allowed for that. Everything she had done lived behind locked doors and silent hallways, buried under layers of clearance that did not fade just because she had stepped into civilian life. She remembered the first briefing room she ever walked into, the long table, the quiet voices, the knowledge that once she stepped into that world, there was no turning back. She carried those memories like an invisible second skin. The room at the clubhouse might have looked simple, but the weight pressing on her shoulders now was the same weight she had felt before missions that would never appear in any public record. That weight lived in her spine, in her hands, in the steady way she kept her breath under control as everyone around her tried to make sense of what they were seeing. They had no idea what it meant to move in the dark without a margin for error. They did not know what it felt like to be flown into places that did not exist on maps, where one wrong step meant the kind of silence that lasted forever. She had spent nights listening for sounds that did not belong, mornings regrouping with teammates who trusted her completely but rarely spoke about fear. They had worked in shadows, relied on signals, gestures, instincts sharpened through repetition. None of that could be explained to people who lived in a world measured by landscaping fees and parking complaints. She could feel their questions rising like heat. What happened to her, where she had been, what those scars meant. But she could not let any of that out. Even attempting to soften the truth would break promises she had carried long after retirement. The missions she had been part of lived in sealed files. The names she had protected were buried under layers of ink and secrecy. She had spent years speaking in coded language and measured sentences, careful not to reveal what should never be spoken. That discipline stayed with her. It did not disappear just because civilians stood in front of her wanting clarity. A man in the third row leaned forward. He opened his mouth as if forming a question, but closed it again when he realized he had no right to ask it. A young woman near the exit stared at the floor, as if trying to process the idea that the quiet neighbor she waved to had once lived in a world shaped by danger instead of routine. She knew what they wanted, but she also knew none of them were prepared for the truth behind each mark carved into her skin. She had stories she had never told. The night she crawled through gravel and broken stone to reach a downed teammate. The morning she waited for extraction with blood drying on her sleeve. The hours she spent in silence inside cramped aircraft where no one spoke because every person on board carried the same understanding. Failure was not an option. But she could not say any of that. Even thinking about specific missions felt like stepping onto ground she had been trained to avoid. People think classified work means secrets. It is more than that. It means carrying events no one else will ever absorb. It means knowing that the hardest moments will never be acknowledged, that the people saved will never know who saved them. It means accepting that the scars left behind are reminders without language. She saw confusion spreading across the room, not just at the sight of her scars, but at the realization that she would not explain them. Some looked frustrated. Others looked unsure. They wanted context to comfort themselves, to sort what they saw into a tidy narrative. But her life had never been tidy. It had been shaped by decisions made in seconds, by missions that shifted course without warning, by outcomes that depended on absolute trust between people who had nothing left except each other. The silence around her grew thick. She held steady, letting her expression remain calm, knowing any attempt to speak would only open doors she had spent years keeping sealed. She heard someone breathe out a slow, unsteady breath. She saw someone else look away, realizing they had crossed into a part of her life they had no right to ask about. She felt the distance between her world and theirs widen, not in anger, but in truth. They had glimpsed something they were not meant to see, and she carried the weight of knowing she could never tell them more. The shift from prejudice to respect did not happen all at once. It unfolded in careful, hesitant beats, like the room needed time to adjust to the reality sitting in front of them. A few minutes earlier, they had treated her like a problem they needed to fix, a disruption that threatened the neatness of their rules. They focused on her uniform, not her humanity. They judged before they asked, and they leaned on regulations because that was easier than considering the person behind the fabric. But once the scars came into view, something in their posture softened. It was not immediate understanding. It was not instant admiration. It was a quiet, uncomfortable recognition that they had misread her completely. The man who had been the first to mutter about rules lowered his eyes, no longer looking at her like she was an inconvenience. His shoulders dropped from the defensive position he had held since the meeting began. He tapped his thumb against his knee, trying to ground himself as if his own certainty felt foreign now. The woman beside him, the one who had nodded firmly when the board president cited dress code regulations, shifted in her seat. Her gaze moved from the scars to the floor, then back again, unsure where she was supposed to look. The confidence they carried earlier was slipping, replaced by something quieter and more reflective. Across the room, a younger neighbor who had seemed indifferent now watched her with a different kind of attention. Not curiosity, something closer to awareness. The shift was subtle. She noticed the stillness in the young woman's hands, the way she folded them together as if acknowledging the moment for what it was. It surprised her. She had expected judgment. She had prepared herself for conflict or dismissal. Respect was not something she had considered possible in a place where people believed they already understood who she was based on a uniform. Even the board president, who had spoken with authority and certainty about the rules, looked different now. Her expression was less rigid. She held her binder closer to her chest, almost protectively, as if it no longer felt like a tool of order but a shield she did not need. She tried to form words, but the sentences did not come. The authority she relied on lost its footing once faced with the truth of what lay beneath the fabric. Rules were simple, scars were not. For years she had walked into rooms where she commanded respect without speaking a word. Uniforms carried weight in those places. People understood what they meant. They knew the cost behind the patches and the decisions that shaped each part of the fabric. But here, respect had never been a given. These were civilians who had never seen beyond their own routines. They understood order, but not sacrifice. They understood guidelines, but not the line between life and death. She had walked more times than she could count. Watching their expressions shift stirred something inside her she did not expect. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something gentler. A small release of tension she did not realize she was holding. She had carried herself carefully from the moment she stepped into the clubhouse, bracing for conflict. Now the conflict was dissolving, replaced by a delicate, unspoken understanding. A man in the back row leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her with a seriousness that felt sincere. He looked like someone who had never served, but he carried a gravity now that suggested he wished he understood more. He was not looking for answers. He was acknowledging something he could not name. That meant more than any apology. A couple near the hallway exchanged uncertain looks. Earlier, they had been among the loudest in their approving nods when the president referenced the dress code. Now their shoulders relaxed and their eyes softened. They looked at her with the kind of reflection that comes only after a person realizes they misjudged a situation. They were seeing her not as a symbol, not as a uniform, but as a human being who had lived through truths they could never imagine. The room's energy changed in small ways. People breathed differently. They sat differently. They held their questions differently. The chatter that had once been sharp and filled with judgment was gone, replaced by a silence that carried weight, but no hostility. It was the silence of consideration, of people reevaluating their own assumptions. She did not move. She let the moment settle. She felt the respect forming slowly, not because they understood her past, but because they realized how much they did not understand. They saw the scars. They saw the restraint. They saw a person who had followed rules far more serious than anything inside a homeowner handbook. Respect did not rise from their sudden knowledge of her history. It rose from the quiet realization that there was more to her than the version they had built in their minds. It rose from the acknowledgement that they had judged too quickly and too sharply. And it rose from seeing, maybe for the first time, that someone among them had carried burdens far beyond their world of meeting agendas and neighborhood disputes. The reminder that quiet neighbors carry untold battles settled over the room in a slow, undeniable wave. It came not from anything she said, because she still had not spoken, but from the raw truth of her presence, from the marks on her skin, from the steady posture of someone who had seen far more than she would ever reveal. People who had treated her like a stranger now had to face the reality that they had been living beside someone whose life held chapters they could not imagine. The shift was subtle but powerful. It revealed something about the assumptions people carry, the stories they build in silence, and the blind spots they never question until something forces them to look closer. The room, once filled with restless energy, now felt caught between reflection and regret. Neighbors who believed they knew everything about everyone on their block suddenly realized how little they actually understood. They could list who liked to garden, who jogged in the mornings, who kept their lights on late at night, but they had never thought about who people were before they moved into the cul-de-sac. They never wondered what someone might have endured, what they had survived, or what parts of their past they kept tucked away because explaining them would mean tearing open wounds best left sealed. A woman in a green sweater wiped her palms on her jeans as if grounding herself in the moment. She had exchanged casual greetings with the former SEAL for months, never imagining the weight behind those simple interactions. She had once assumed her neighbor's quiet nature meant shyness or indifference. Now she realized that quiet can come from discipline, from experience, from the effort to blend in after spending years in environments where blending meant survival. An older man who usually sat silently in the back of the meetings now looked at her with something close to recognition. Maybe he had served in another era. Maybe he knew enough to understand that the stories carried by soldiers rarely make it into conversation. The look he gave her was not pity. It was understanding between two people who knew that some truths live in the space between words. He gave a small nod. It was the kind of gesture that carried more weight than paragraphs. People often believe they know who their neighbors are because they share sidewalks and mailboxes. They see each other mowing lawns, carrying groceries, waving from driveways. But none of those glimpses reveal the deeper layers, the pieces shaped by history, sacrifice, fear, courage, loss, or resilience. They saw only what fit neatly into their routine. They never imagined that the woman who preferred early morning walks once moved through hostile landscapes under night vision. They never imagined that the neighbor who kept to herself had spent years making decisions that determined who lived and who did not. They never thought that someone on their street carried memories scarred into their skin. A sense of humility settled into the group as they absorbed that truth. It was not the dramatic kind. It was quiet, reflective, almost ashamed. They realized how quickly they had judged, how easily they had labeled her without knowing anything real about her. They realized how often they assumed the easiest story instead of the truest one. They realized that scars are not always visible, and that many people walk through their days carrying private histories shaped by moments others could not endure. She watched the shift unfold without changing her expression. She had lived through enough to know that most people never look closely until they are forced to. She did not blame them. She also did not owe them anything. But she could feel something lighter forming in the room, something that hinted at understanding, at least in the smallest measure. They would not know her story. They would not know the missions that shaped her. But they now knew that she was more than the uniform they had tried to police. The neighbors looked around the room with a new sense of awareness. If they had been wrong about her, who else had they misread? What quiet burdens were carried behind the polite smiles of the man next door, or the elderly woman walking her dog, or the teenager who rarely made eye contact? Their world felt different now because they finally understood that everyone carries something unseen. And some people carry far more than they ever say out loud. The clubhouse felt smaller as that realization settled in. People sat straighter, not out of defensiveness, but out of respect for the gravity of the moment. They looked at each other differently, almost cautiously, as though acknowledging the possibility that everyone in the room was more complicated than they first believed. And for the first time, the room held a sense of unity not built on rules or appearances, but on the quiet truth that lives beneath the surface of every person they thought they already understood.